I talked about this in my last video, talking about you're going to see crime sprees. And of course, the narrative is always the same, that if you talk about this stuff, well, you're racist or you're picking on a particular group. And then you see stuff like this. And it's typically a lot of this stuff doesn't get talked about enough. And even in the Hispanic communities, it doesn't surprise me to see that a lot of the crime that goes on in many of these neighborhoods is typically one-sided. I mean, it's a perfect example in New York when they were constantly, cheering for, we need to stop the hate against the Asians. And it's like, well, who's committing all the crimes against those Asians? And of course, that part of the conversation was never talked about. And so here in New York City, in a New York City bodega, you have a bodega worker by the name of Jose Alba, who was charged with murder because he defended himself against an ex-con who attacked him over a bag of potato chips. The story was that his girlfriend came in. Of course, she was trying to buy a bag of chips off of EBT, and that's why I say a lot of this stuff is related to culture and related to welfare. And of course, she comes in and she's like, I want to buy a bag of chips. And he's telling her, you don't have any money on your card. And allegedly, the narrative was that he snatched the chips out of the kid's hand, and she went back and got her boyfriend. And of course, he came back and then he attacked him. You can see the video here where the bodega worker starts wrestling with this. He comes in. He's clearly already behind the counter. The guy's behind the counter. You can see this is an elderly man. I believe he was 34, and Jose Alba is, I believe, 51. And so he's not an old man, but obviously you can see he's a small guy. He's already got the thick gray beard, etc. And this is what you see happening. The guy's all up in his face. And of course, if you talk about this, if you talk about the intimidations in your neighborhoods by certain groups of individuals, well, then you must be a racist. No, it's this particular group or it's that particular group. It happens with these people as well. And then this is what happens. And then when you protect yourself, and this is why I said in my last video that if you protect yourself, that what happens is that they eventually come for you, right? The guy defended himself. He got pushed into a corner. He was backed into a corner. Allegedly, from Mr. Alba, he had said that the girlfriend had stabbed him in the shoulder, and he was arrested. The guy ends up getting stabbed as he goes to defend himself. And like I said, in New York, they're going to come get you when you choose to protect. There was video showing that is a clear case of self-defense, and originally they had him on like $250,000 on bail. It eventually, thankfully, got reduced to $50,000. But when you talk about this stuff, it becomes it's like, well, you're a racist, and I'm like, well, what happens when it happens to the Latinos? But by that time, you already have a problem. I see for many in New York City, this is going to be the problem moving forward. They like to push the race narrative. Instead of just dealing with these individuals based off of their actions, they make it a race thing. If you speak out against this particular group, well, then it's because you're a racist. I mean, now, mind you, you haven't seen groups of Latinos talking about Latino lives matter when some random Latino thug gets killed. If anything, the Latino community is appreciative of when these individuals are removed from society, either through putting them in jail or through putting them down. You don't see people out there marching in the streets and we're going to burn it all down because you killed one of our up and coming, thugs. That doesn't happen. But in other groups, this is what you see. And so even, it's more of the policies that are put in place by many of these democratic liberal cities. And this is another example. This is also from the New York Post of an illegal immigrant who was accused of raping a 13-year-old girl in Brooklyn, who was then cut loose. And this is by the Hispanic DA, right? But it says, but Brooklyn DA Eric Gonzalez's office didn't ask the judge to set bail. The criminal court judge Hillary Gincold agreed to let him go on supervised release. And then, even though there's an article here talking about how ICE arrests illegal immigrant accused of raping Brooklyn teen after city cut him loose. And this was back in May of 2020. And so the issue is not a race thing. The issue is that certain people are getting privileges that other groups are not. So if you're a minority Latino and you get attacked by a minority that is more preferred than you, well, then There's no privilege there. You, in essence, are viewed as the white person. If you're a light-skinned Latino, they're going to be like, oh, you look white enough, right? Like the whole, what was his name? George Zimmerman, and everybody was calling him a white guy, but the guy was Latino. And that's exactly what happens. How can we make what happened fit the narrative for our purpose so that we can push our liberal agenda? And this is what's going to happen moving forward. This is why when business owners move away from many of these places, then all of these other groups are going to cry foul. How come we don't have, there's food deserts, there's pharmacy deserts, etc. Oh, it's racism, blah, 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 blah. When it's a cultural issue, what you end up is with a cultural issue, and you end up with a welfare issue. This is the problem. The problem is the culture, and more often it's poverty related to welfare. And it continues to breed these types of individuals. And it doesn't become a problem as long as the law will put these individuals, when they commit crimes, will put them in jail. But when these individuals get loose, this guy right here, the one that ended up getting killed, he was an ex-con. He had recently let loose out of jail. And then as soon as they come right back out, they do the same thing over and over again. And a lot of times when you look at these liberal cities, this is what happens. And it's always one-sided. It's always one-sided. You don't see these, Hispanic people committing these crimes, or pick your race, right? Asians, Koreans, Chinese, etc. Right? You don't see that sort of favor. If anything, you see the opposite. You see the Asians being targeted as as also being whites. The light-skinned individuals also being targeted as whites. I mean, here in Colombia, there's plenty of Afro-Latinos here, but the culture is different. The culture here is different. They're very hardworking individuals, and there's no welfare here, so you don't see the type of crime. I mean, shoot, I walk into some of these neighborhoods that you would think there's a lot of shit that goes down, and people would be afraid, and they're very nice people, even though they're very poor, because it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the culture, and more often than not, it has to do with welfare and single motherhood. And this is typically what you get when there's no sort of authority figure in the home. These individuals don't fear authority until they come face to face with it. And usually it's at the hands of the police, more often than not, or a citizen who's willing to defend himself. Anyway, feel free to leave your comment below, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll check you next time.